Hello, everybody, and welcome to a special edition of A Better Life with George and Steve. Unfortunately, tonight we don't have George with us. He had a family thing. He had to fly back to Tokyo, and he's there now. And their nights are our days, and their days, I think, they're 14 hours ahead. Being Thanksgiving and everything, I did want to just take a few minutes and come on and do a little blip on Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving's one of those holidays where we always remember where we come from, what we did as children. It's a holiday that we memorialize as kids in grammar school, making little cutouts of turkeys and on blue paper and doing things like that. When I was a kid, my cousins didn't come over like they did on every other holiday. It was mostly my grandparents and things, so it wasn't quite the same. Then you got a little older, you made your way to the high school football game on Thanksgiving, where you saw some of your friends. Then as you get older, you go because you play football. And then when you get older after that, you go back and see your friends from high school on that day. And it's something that everybody kind of reunites at. And over time, you just don't do it at all anymore. You don't look at those things like you used to. One of my great memories as a child is some of the early morning television shows that you watched on Thanksgiving. My favorite was, strangely enough, you watched the parade. You watch the parades, you watch for the balloons. Back then, they had big, huge balloons that they could hardly hold on to. They floated high in the sky, and they were pretty much magical. That all came to a crashing halt when they lost control of balloons and some people were injured. Now the balloons are small and not the same. Not the same as they were but way back when. And the characters change all the time, too. My favorite, of course, was Underdog. Back in the day, Underdog was a cartoon. It was on from like 1964 to 67. So basically when I was 5 to 7 years old, and it was in syndication all the way up to 1973. And there was a famous Thanksgiving episode, actually it was a 4-part episode, about Underdog and Underdog was almost like a satire of a superhero. First of all, it was a dog. Second of all, it was played by a gentleman named Wally Cox, who always played these wimpy kind of parts. It was funny like that. And it was sponsored by General Mills, if I remember correctly. And it was on NBC on Saturday morning cartoons for a long time. And then it switched to CBS later in its run. But when it hit syndication, it used to be on the famous Thanksgiving episodes. It was really a 4-part episode, but they played them together, where the protagonist, Simon Bar Sinister, the evil one, goes back in time to try to destroy Thanksgiving to prevent it from happening, which pretty much became a recurring theme in time travel television shows and movies, where they try to change the future by changing the past. Underdog was a shoeshine boy that turned into a superhero. His romantic interest was Sweet Polly Purebred. Remember, the call sign was, "There's no need to fear, Underdog is here." And that was something I always watched on Thanksgiving. And the other is probably the one that I would bet most of you, if not all of you, watched. And that was Babes in Toyland, which was later changed to the name or known as March of the Wooden Soldiers, which was a abridged version of the original movie, Babes in Toyland. It was, I think, cut down. It was a 1934 film. It starred Laurel and Hardy, for those of you who don't know it. It's pretty much like Inside a Nursery Rhyme, the story where there's an evil guy trying to take a shoe. A woman lived in a shoe, trying to take back the shoe so the woman has no place to live, and something like that. And there was Mother Peep, Bo Peep, the story on and on like that. But the interesting part is, in interests of trying to save the woman and save everything, it was produced by Hal Roach, who was a famous producer at the time and was for many years afterwards. What was interesting, too, is they had these robots, and they really weren't robots. They were wound-up toy soldiers who were actually humans with paint on their faces. And the great thing is they wind all these toys up, and then they're like soldiers. They're toy soldiers. And they go out and save the world and save everything, and everything becomes good. It was a classic, and you never saw it on television because it was so old. But it was one of the things you watched on Thanksgiving. It was on all the time, besides the parade. The parade was big, and then it switched to football. After that, you started to watch football all the time, usually. All the time Dallas, and all the time Detroit. And Detroit rarely lost on Thanksgiving. And then John Madden, when he became an announcer after he left football for good, he made it famous. He had special awards. He had a 4-legged turkey that he used to cook and give out to the most valuable players in his mind of the football game. John Madden, who just died recently, was a wonder for American football. First of all, he was a great coach. I remember him telling a story about he was a young coach, and he really felt he knew a lot about football, more than anybody else. So he goes to a 2-day seminar. I don't know if it was 1 or 2 days, but he goes to this seminar about football, offensive football, given by Vince Lombardi. And the entire seminar, which went on, I think, for a whole day, Vince Lombardi talked about one running play and went through all the nuances. And I remember Madden saying after he left there, he went in thinking he knew everything about football, and he left realizing he knew nothing about football. And that's the amazing mind of Vince Lombardi. What he knew, what he learned, what he gave to people, what he taught, changed the game. Probably the father of American football. Really was a force for the Green Bay Packers. But before that, he played at Fordham. He was a football player at Fordham. And he was one of the rocks of granite. Yes, Vince Lombardi was the original 7 blocks of granite for Fordham University. So it was referred to in the Fordham line, and 29, 30, 37, and 36. Lombardi, of course, left there. And they played, my recollection is Fordham at that time played at Yankee Stadium. That was a real big deal. And Lombardi, he went to St. Francis Prep. He then later went to Fordham, and that was his college. And as a player, he played a little bit for the Wilmington Clippers and then the Brooklyn Eagles, which I'm guessing at the time is like a semi-pro team. His career is amazing. He was first with Salesian School, then St. Cecilia School in New Jersey, high school, as an assistant, then a head coach, then Fordham as an assistant, Army as an assistant, the New York Giants 54 to 58. He was the offensive coordinator, and then he went to the Packers as a head coach and general manager from 59 and 67. He later, after he left the Packers, he took a year or so off, and then he went to the Redskins as head coach and general manager. And I always heard stories from my ex-wife's uncle who played at the played at the Redskins during that time period. And they were both guys from the Bronx. He had plenty of stories about him. Lombardi won 2 Super Bowls, 3 NFL championships, was a coach of the year twice, was the 100th anniversary all-team Green Bay Packers Hall of Fame, and the Washington Commanders, formerly Washington Redskins, Ring of Honor. His lifetime won and loss record was 96, 34, and 6. He was quite a force, and still is. Still talked about. The trophy is made. The winning Super Bowl trophy is named after him. That's all you need to say. So being at Thanksgiving Eve tomorrow, I'm looking forward to some football. I'm looking forward to some turkey. The other thing I wanted to mention, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention it, and this is an abbreviated version of our usual podcast that I'm here by myself. Like I said, George had a family thing he had to go back to Tokyo for. He wanted to try to do it remotely, but I figured I'd wait till he gets back. So the other thing I did want to talk about, Today being Thanksgiving Eve, being November 22nd, 2023, is the 60th anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Probably most of you that are listening out there weren't alive when that happened. I was, though I was little. I was almost 5. But back then, I remember that day. It's pretty close to my first memory of life, only because of the dramatic events that day. I wasn't 5 yet, so I wasn't in kindergarten. And the shooting took place at 12:30 in the middle of the afternoon or the early part of the afternoon. And my mom was always working, cleaning, cooking, that kind of thing at that time. She was a stay-at-home mom. But she took an hour off every day to watch her favorite soap opera, As the World Turns. And that ran from 12 to 1. And 12 noon to 1 o'clock. She would sit me on her lap, and she would watch the soap opera and play with me. And that day, the assassination took place at about 12:30. It probably was first announced, broken in by television shortly after that, maybe 5 to 10 minutes later. And I remember my mom starting to cry. Then Walter Cronkite comes on around 1, a little later than 1, and announces that the president had died, expired at 1 o'clock. My mother was crying hysterically. And as a kid, I was upset by that. I remember that. I remember her being upset. I remember lots of conversations about it in the household, I guess a little bit over my head. I also remember that nobody believed that one person killed him. Everybody at the time, if I remember correctly, thought the Russians were involved and this was involved and how did this happen and this brutal murder. The Zapruder film that we all see today didn't come out for years and years later. It was confiscated by the Secret Service and never saw the light of day. I want to say at least for 7 years, if not around that, less. So it was never seen. There were some pictures in Life magazine. In that Life magazine, those pictures were taken from the Zapruder film, and they were the first that America saw of what happened on that day. So the next memory I have is that I want to say it's Sunday morning. It was the only day my dad was actually home. He worked 2 jobs. Back then he drove a laundry truck. He drove a laundry truck in Ramsey, New Jersey at Ramsey Laundry, where he had a route sales job where he delivered laundry. And some days especially when I was little, in the summer when I didn't have school, I'd go out with him on the truck, which was always a treat. But Sunday was, and his second job is he worked at Bamberger's, which is the New Jersey version of Macy's, and now they're all Macy's. But at one time it was named Bamberger's. So he would, I think, 4 hours. He would work like 3 nights a week and Saturday. So he would work all day on the laundry truck. Then he would come home, eat something real quick, and then he would go down to Bamberger's and work as a stock boy till 10 o'clock and then come home and the next day do it all over again. Then he would work there all day on Saturday, if I recall, especially during the holiday season. At that time, and as it is now, there were blue laws in Bergen County, New Jersey. So stores aren't open on those days. So people that worked retail actually got a day of rest on that day and still do. It is the last place in the United States that the blue laws still exist. So that morning, my mother used to buy these Pillsbury biscuits in the little container. And so on Sundays, he would have 2 containers, and she would bust them open and cook them. And we'd all sit around as a family on Sunday morning with butter and the biscuits, and they would have coffee, and I guess we drank milk. I wasn't a real milk guy. I may have drank water, but unless it was chocolate milk. I drank chocolate milk every Sunday morning. My sister, who was 5 years, it still is 5 years older than me. So I was 5 at the time. She was 10. And we also, once in a while, and this Sunday was one of those once in a whiles, we had these TV trays that would fold out, and we'd all have our coffee or milk and the biscuits and sit there and watch television in the morning. This morning we chose to do that because my mother and father were aware that Lee Harvey Oswald was going to be walked out in the first time. Pretty much that we got to see this man who shot John F. Kennedy for ourselves. And as we all know, as they're walking him out, he is shot and killed by a man named Jack Ruby. Right there in front of your face on live television, which is probably the first real live tragedy on national television, I would say. You saw other things in the past, if you look back through history, but not as spontaneous as this was. And I just remember my father saying, that's the end of that. Now we're never going to know what happened. Here we are, 60 years later, and we still don't know what happened. But for some reason, in whoever the powers that be that control the information in the world has decided, I've heard them referred to as deep state. These deep state powers that be are starting to release some information, and people are talking that never talked before. Some of that could be because the Kennedy Assassination Records Act, or whatever it's called, is forcing the government to release records that they've kept sealed, though there are still some records sealed that are argued that they're to protect national security issues. Now, I find it hard to believe that there's any national security issues other than looking stupid or dumb, but so there are still some. These records are gone through, and we've learned many things. Oliver Stone, who did the movie JFK, he always maintained that it was his fight to get this information out that produced this to happen. And he may be right. I'm not sure. I don't have any of that information. But he fought, and he fought the Congress, and these records, and Congress looked into it a couple of times. And he's produced two new documentaries. One was JFK Revisited Through the Looking Glass, which was on Showtime, and there was a more in-depth version that you could. I don't know if it was shown anywhere, but I bought it on iTunes. It's called JF Destiny Betrayed, and they go through these records. These people, these investigators go through the new records that were released. And what do we learn? We learned many things. That the Warren Commission, who was put together by LBJ to look into this stuff and named after Earl Warren, who was the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court at the time, made up of these blue ribbon panels, one of which was a man named Dulles, who was the former director of the CIA until Kennedy fired him, and they hated each other, which was an interesting choice. And another interesting name is Congressman Gerald Ford, who was, I don't know if he was Speaker of the House yet, but he was definitely a congressman, and I think from Michigan he was. Interesting enough, Gerald Ford, what we now know, was the person that changed the angle of the bullet on the records from the autopsy to allow for the magic bullet theory. So what's the magic bullet theory for you people out there that don't know? And to have Lee Harvey Oswald be the lone assassin, you need him only to shoot 3 bullets because it was impossible in the time frame to shoot any more. So both Kennedy and John Connally, who was the governor of California, were struck by bullets. Alan Specter, who was a junior senator or just an attorney, he may have been an attorney from Philadelphia that worked on the committee, came up with this magic bullet theory, that it was one bullet that hit both Kennedy and Connally. It went on a trajectory that was impossible, was against the law of physics, and yet they found a pristine bullet on the gurney where Kennedy was that happened to match the rifle that supposedly Lee Harvey Oswald used. And they argued that was the bullet. not only was it magic, but it also wasn't damaged while it was magic, while it went through Kennedy's body, while it hit John Connolly, while it went through his body, while it hit him in the wrist. It's impossible. But they came up with this theory. They doctored the evidence, and that's what they did. That's one of the things you learn on this documentary. It's interesting. So if you're interested, I'm going to just let you know some of the other documentaries that are out there that are all brand new, just starting to come out. On Paramount Plus, just came out the other day, there's a documentary called What the Doctors Saw. These are the original doctors from Parkland, which is a hospital in Dallas. The Secret Service would not let an autopsy be completed. These doctors are the ones that treated him, JFK, in the emergency room. And there's a lot of arguments about exit wounds, that there was an entrance wound in his neck. If there was an entrance wound in his neck, it would be impossible for Lee Harvey Oswald to have been the only shooter. The doctors talk about how they said that. And the Secret Service took Kennedy's body and went back to Washington, D.C. with it against the medical examiner of Dallas County request that, and it was more than a request, that this was a murder that took place in Dallas. It's really a state law because there wasn't a federal law at the time that made it illegal federally to shoot the President of the United States. It was just a, excuse the expression, run-of-the-mill murder. As the doctors explained, that the coroner stood in the doorway and said, you can't leave with the body. This is our issue. A Secret Service agent picked him up, moved him out of the way, and pushed him up against the wall, waved his finger in his face. And they took the body, went back to Washington. They went to the military hospital. They got 2 military officers or 3 military officers to do the autopsy. And, of course, they had never done a gunshot autopsy before. That's an interesting story. The other one there's a couple on Hulu that are quite interesting. One is, and these are just the new ones that just came out this year. One is JFK, One Day in America, which basically are interviews with the remaining living witnesses, whether they were neighbors of Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina, who was his wife, whether they were newsmen, whether they were police officers, whether they were co-workers. They have an interview with a gentleman that drove Lee Harvey Oswald to work that day. And it's a 3-part documentary, and that's on Hulu. These all came out this November, so they all came out this month. There is an interesting, because there is Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina, his wife's next-door neighbor, was a woman named Payne, Mrs. Payne. And she is in this documentary. There is also a documentary about her, and that's a movie documentary, and it's available through iTunes. I don't know where else it is. But Mrs. Payne, that just came out this year. Turns out that she ends up being their next-door neighbors. It turns out that supposedly his rifle was actually kept in her garage. So when the cops got there, they went out to the garage, and of course it was not there, which I found as an interesting thing. The name of the documentary that just came out this year, it's called The Assassination and Mrs. Payne. You will find that Mrs. Payne and her husband have significant ties to the CIA, that she spoke 5 languages, including Russian, that there is a lot of questions on who Mrs. Payne really is, and we have no idea who that could be. But it seems like she had some relationships to the CIA. Another one's a little less assassination-centric is the Lady Bird Diaries. Their original recordings that Lady Bird Johnson, the first lady who took over after the assassination, obviously, kept recorded diaries of the time. Things she told her husband, thought she had about Jacqueline Kennedy. And she is an interesting person. She really is a force, more than I knew at the time, certainly. And that's also on Hulu, if you want to watch. Now, there is the beginning of a multi-part I'm not sure if it's a movie documentary or a television show documentary. I happen to own it. I bought it. I haven't watched it yet. And the name of it's just a prologue. It was released. It actually was released today. And it's called They Died Trying. And it just says prologue. And referenced in they are John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X. So somehow this documentary is going to entwine these gentlemen somehow. It's directed by a man named John Hardy, and I'm looking forward to watching it. I don't want to get into a lot of the who did what to who and who could have killed Kennedy, but it seems that you could guess. There's a million guesses, whether it was the mob, whether it was the CIA, whether it was the CIA and the mob, whether it was the Cubans, whether it was the Russians. We can go on and on. The reality is, at least for us as we sit here today, is what do we know? We know our government knew more and went through great lengths to cover it up. Why? I don't think we'll ever know. The body's buried. They don't even. They took out Kennedy's brain, put it in the Smithsonian. That's disappeared one day. All these things happened. It's impossible to go that far back. We know that what we were told is not the truth, but we don't know what the truth is. And I think I will leave you with that. I wish everyone happy Thanksgiving. I hope you're listening to this during Thanksgiving. You may hear it afterwards. And like I said, this is a special edition without my partner in crime, George. He would be bored to death about what I just talked about, and hopefully you're not bored to death listening to me. These are things I tried to talk about a couple times, and George waved me off, and now you know why. All right, so everyone have a happy Thanksgiving. If you're listening to this tomorrow, hopefully it gets out by tomorrow. If not, hopefully next week, we'll go back to our regular show with George, whether I have to do it. He's going to be there and I'm going to be here. We're going to get back. We have a lot more guests. And just as a little primer, we're also going to do a part 2 with Nicole and Ryan regarding Japan. We didn't talk about pizza. We didn't talk about fast food. There may be some pictures that were posted on Instagram by George that you see some of that fast food that he is eating in the time. Matter of fact, he went and got some tonight or last night, depending on the time change as you look at it, or tomorrow night. And he's taking pictures, and he wanted to talk about that as well. We're also going to talk about pizza, something about Japanese pizza. I have no idea what it is. I can't believe it's better than New York pizza or even Westchester pizza. Most recently, you saw Portnoy, who goes around doing one bite of the pizza, saying that Westchester pizza is some of the best he's ever had. And I would agree with him. There are some great pizza parlors in Westchester, and one of them's right here in Hartsdale, where I live. Hartsdale House of Pizza. He has great pizza. I don't know what he does to it. It's great pizza. Sal's in Mamaroneck is great pizza. It's I prefer the Sicilian pie there. Johnny's in Mount Vernon, as you know, is great pizza as well. All right, moving on from pizza. So we're also, George's friend in California is going to come on and speak about, he is a farmer, or I believe organic farmer, where he has an organic garden that he is very passionate about. And we're going to talk about what he does to grow his vegetables, and we'll post some pictures with that too. For now, we're going to stay audio, just in case anybody's asking. We like audio. We're going to do supplemental videos, I think, maybe with Franco, going through some things in Italy. Having said all that, I wish you all a happy Thanksgiving. Forgiveness is everything. Try to forgive. It's the only way you're going to get through life. Have a good one, everybody.